Hi, this is Kove, and welcome to my production course for DNB Academy. Full breakdown of a whole track over the course of about 8 hours. Tips and tricks, synthesis, drum synthesis, bit of everything in there, and a real insight. Hi, this is Kove, and welcome to my breakdown of my track tonight, which I've done for the guys at DNB Academy to introduce my full course that I've done for them, which is a full breakdown of a whole track over the course of about 8 hours. Tips and tricks, synthesis, drum synthesis, bit of everything in there, and a real insight into the way I work. But as I said, to sort of introduce this, we're going to go through an old tune of mine, one of my personal favourites. We're going to go through a tune called Tonight, which came out in Drum Bass Arena a couple of years ago. I still play it out all the time. I really like it. Also, I'm going to get around to answering some of your questions, which have been submitted. But first, I think we should kick off with this tune. And if you don't know it, I'll play the main build-up and drop. It's quite a simple sort of subby roller, which is all really based around a vocal sample, which is something that my course will elaborate quite a lot. So yeah, just sort of a very simple bass line. I think I was thinking a lot about sort of Ram Trilogy era S tunes, where it was just, a really sort of nice slidey sub with a couple of augmentations on it. But really, like, a lot of my tunes start off was a sample, which is something I think super common, especially in the way I work, which was from Loletta Holloway. Now that was originally the inspiration for this tune, but we couldn't use it. But eventually we'll come on to what happened there. So from that sort of gave me this sort of feeling that, it was sort of calling people into a club. So the next thing I did was to create this sort of foundation for the tune, and then I moved on to the drop. So initially was this idea, which I've called Club Beat. And all this is a beat that's just been which I had from another tune, which has just been low passed and then thrown through a load of reverb and then jacked up with the Waves MV2 just to really sort of squash that down and hyper compress it. And that's to give the idea of being in a club. And from there, that's when I thought, okay, I'll move on to the sort of drop element now. And again, this is something that in my course I come around to, which is I never really work in a sort of linear way. It's sort of jumping around the track and then sort of gluing it together. I think initially, after this, I wanted to do the bass and then build around there. So if we jump to the bass, it's sort of just several quite simple layers all working together. So I'll just play them through as one. So all just very subby sounds, like slightly overdriven sounds. And we'll just go a little bit more deep into that. So play that in context. And actually, that's later on the drop. So the main drop section would have been this. So I think just coming up with a really simple sort of slidey riff, which is what really kicked this tune off in conjunction with that sort of clubby beat idea I had before. So the initial main sort of riff is this really. That's one layer on there. So we'll just find, yeah, so this is the layer that was at the start of the tune, which is here. Now, if I take all the plugins off that, it's actually a pretty dull, boring sound. It's just literally an 808 sine. So you're just with a really strong transient on it. And all that is just, it's got, you know, a little bit of overdrive to it, but that's pretty much it. I mean, even when I take off the groove processing as well, all it is just a sub. So when it comes to these sort of really subby basses, it's important to try and get some tonality out of it. So I think I started off with this preset in Fat Effects, which is Logic's sort of reimagining of camel fat. And if you don't know and you're missing camel fat, this is camel fat. Just, you know, they bought them out. So it's very useful to have. Next thing I did was to dip out a little bit of this really resonant area around here. Because that's just boxy and it doesn't sound good. So we want to get rid of that and just really sort of concentrate on getting these overtones. Now there's another quite severe EQ here, which is almost sort of tilting the tune. Or tilting the bass by bringing out, I mean, this is sort of pretty brutal stuff I'm doing, you know, 13, 14 dB of reduction, but there's so much sort of distortion and sub that I wanted to layer that out quite a lot. Next up was Saturn, which is adding even more distortion onto the top of this. You know, that's some pretty brutal stuff again. And the last thing on there is Logic's auto filter. And what I've done here is I've used the fatness and the cutoff just to bring that down. So we're just getting a little bit of the overtones through, and we're getting, you know, that thick sub coming through again. So really it's a case of, with this, distorting it and then bringing it back. So rather than just having a sort of mess of overtones on there. And then to layer on top of there, well, actually, we'll start off with this one first, which I think is just a bounce of this layer, just with the filter cut off slightly higher, so you get more of those overtones. We'll just see what this was doing. It's always fun going back through old tunes to sort of find out what you were doing a couple of years ago. So that's all that is, just a stab, 808 stab. It's just got a click on it, which I really should have cleaned up, but I didn't. So that's the first half of that riff. So it's a really simple two bar riff. And the next part of that riff is this, which was made in FM8. I don't really know what I'm doing with FM8. So I probably just copied this off something, or copied this off a tutorial or something. And then, you know, it's beyond my sort of realms as a synthesizer user. So if I take the plugins off it, yeah, it's quite a fat, thick, sort of warm sound again. Similar process of just fattening it up using the cutoff on the auto filter. Fat effects again with the same preset. And I've used Homicide, which is actually a plugin I had for years, and then I never really got back into it, and I really should, because it's awesome. I think I was just doing some, you know, messing around with that to find some distorted overtones. Then some really severe EQ again, and again I'm just low passing this again, bringing it up, getting all the overtones, and then just getting these sort of the resonances lower down, the harmonics lower down the frequency range. Then I've used CLA vocals on the bass, which probably in hindsight wasn't the smartest idea, but I've just used the stereo widening there and a little bit of compression. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that now. So that together. Also what I've done here is I think I've then bounced that out just so I've got more control over it. So that was the original bass sound. Then I've pitched it up a semitone, because I think originally I wrote this tune in G, and I've just pitched it up to G sharp. And I've just taken a little bit of this boxy area again. I think, you know, when it comes to distortion and distorting distorting bass, you get so many low harmonics, so they need to be cleaned up and taken out, otherwise it just becomes a super boxy mess. Then I've used the imager, where I've taken out all the this is the ozone imager, and I've taken out all the lows and just monoed them, because you see if I bring that back up, that's made them mad. So I've just taken that down, so everything below 140 Hertz is now completely mono. Which actually brings me on to, I think, one of the first viewer questions, which was, do I ever mix in mono? And the answer is no. I've never really sort of gone down that route. I tried it a couple of times to sort of focus a bit more on side information. But in the end, I think I'm so used to sort of focusing on stereo, and, you know, I love reverb and things, so I found it sort of always quite hard to you know, sort of translate from just doing mono, and then the idea that it opens up really wide. Obviously it is important to have mono elements in your track, like the kick and the sub, or otherwise, you know, beyond the whole thing about it would be hard to play in a club, you get mad phase issues, and just towards the end of the line, it's just even harder to work with when you're coming to do your final mix and master. So, you know, I think sort of anywhere, you know, I think now actually you get tunes with like kicks that are quite wide and sort of in that 200 area, which I think you can get away with a bit of warmth, sort of around 200, 250, and a bit of width. But for sort of straight up sort of dance floor stuff, everything 200 and below, try and keep as centered as possible, just for the most amount of power. So yeah, as I was saying, I've bounced this out. And then, so we've got our simple riff here of these 3 layers. So just sub, really. Which is just process sub. But we need to sort of augment this a bit more. So what I've done is, I've copied the main riff and I've opened up this massive. I'll just bring up the gain on this. Now, this is sort of a quite messy layer, which is really just a sine wave with a load of the built-in distortion, just to try and bring out some more harmonics to layer on top of this 808. And it sounds like a bit of a mess together, but it seems to work in context. And again, similar process. Fat FX, homicide, for some extra drive. And I've taken out all the lows on this because I didn't really want that sort of conflicting with the sub. And then taking out this boxy area around 250 again. Same sort of EQ, a tilt EQ, again to sort of bring out those tops. I mean, I probably just copied a lot of the plugins over from the channel. Auto filter again, just to make sure there's nothing too high frequency. Satin. What I've done here is I've just split the band so there's nothing really sort of too mad going on here. And then on the real top ends, just to get a slight hint of fizz, I've really like just separated the band here at 9,000 and really jacked the treble, which is a great thing about Satin because it is multiband. Then VCLA vocals again, which I've done to really widen it out. But again, as I was referring to earlier, I've taken out everything, you know, in that sort of really critical area. So, you know, it's probably fine when it comes to phase, and it's not messing with that lower bass, the lower bass at all, really. So we've got that rolling through now. We need a couple of extra bits on top of that. So what I've done is And this is so there's like really just two sounds here. Now what this first one is what I actually use this in loads of tunes. It's a little sample that I think I made years and years ago. Like I think when I was doing Give 'Em Hell, one of my old tunes, this was sort of a big part of that tune. So I think this has just sort of ended up being cut out and processed, and it's just literally a sine sweep going down that's really distorted. As you can see, I've piled on loads of overdrive. And compressed it. Just with Logic's own compressor, just to give it a bit more aggression. And yeah, just a little things like that, especially on these sort of beats where just the hat-is do really well, especially when you got a just a straight, you know, eighth note rhythm. It does really well to just sort of break that. It just sort of gives a nice little launch in if I do that with four beats rather than three. Just there. If I take that out, it really loses a lot of that shuffle. So it's good to have something that's sort of like going down and then into the next section of that riff. Then we've got this, which is rip bass, which is, I take off the processing. I would imagine that would have been a bounce just from this FM8, because the waveform's looking pretty similar, where I've just, yeah, low cut it, bounced it out. And then I just distorted it. Especially when you're doing these sort of sounds, it's really nice. This area around here, 650, 500, it gets so nasally with distortion. You know, if you think about like a guitar amp, you know, most distorted guitar sounds have all the mid scooped out, just because it's so honky and horrible. And that's a good way of getting like a really sort of smooth sound going on there. You know, just in terms of the mid-range. And I've overdriven it. Logic's overdrive is really, really good for like just nice, soft through to hard clipping. It's a great way of getting volume as well, without increasing, you know, without increasing your actual output. So I do that a lot. Compressor is just controlling it a bit, not too much sort of going on there, and then I've used Driver from Native Instruments, which I think is just giving a tiny amount of distortion. Yeah, it's just really fizzing up that top end, a bit like a stomp box. So that sits well on top. So rather than it just sort of being, you know, a sort of fairly boring call and response just with sine waves, we've got a riff now which has, if I play it in full, we've got a riff that has a really good call and response. And so having that is really useful when it comes to bass lines, having call and responses. You know, just because it's such a sort of classic old thing in music to have call and response. So why not use it in your riffs? There was also a little bit of extra processing here on the pedal board, which is something I use a lot actually. Hi, this is Kove, and welcome to my production course for DNB Academy. Full breakdown of the whole track over the course of about 8 hours. You know, tips and tricks, synthesis, drum synthesis, bit of everything in there, and you know, a real insight. So that's giving it a really sort of guitar overdriven tone. And this is Logic's built in. It's got some really cool stuff in here. It's got great spring reverbs, great space delays. Yeah, so check that out, because that's a cool little plugin. And then moving on to the second half of this riff, because it really does just repeat and repeat. So I've just copied over the envelope bass here as well. So it's just an ever so slight variation on that too, you know, throughout those 4 bars. So that's what we've got rolling there. And then just coming into this last sort of section towards the end of the 8. No bass at all, which is a really cool way of having a break. Doesn't have to be bass all the time, you know, because this is such a sub-heavy tune. It's nice to have that sort of break where, you know, have something else going on there like we've got going on in the drums. So really the last thing on the bass, as I say, this was sort of a very simple bass tune when it came down to it, was... And this is something, I think essentially it's the same bass sound as the original one. And this is something that I talk about a lot in the course, which is trying to make the most out of a few things rather than just piling on new sounds and new synthesizing things. Just because it gives you a bit more sort of homogeny within your tune. And again, similar sort of process would have been taking it from sub through to adding harmonics. Again, that tilt EQ seems to be the main thing with all these basses, which is sort of creating that fuzzy sound. Take that off. All the sub goes away. Auto filter again. I think that's got a little LFO on it this time. And auto filter is really useful. It's a great plugin. And the distortion on it is fantastic. Really warm. Then I put Valhalla Room on it on a bass, which probably wouldn't recommend, but it works in this context. Saturn again. Now this is again where we're getting the grinding sound coming out of it. By splitting it into 3 bands. This top end band is absolutely jacked, just with this tape saturation. The mid band is still retaining a lot of that warmth. So that's got the tape on it, so that's keeping that warmth. So this top end actually has the amp on it. This is why it sounds so ampy. Vocals, CLA vocals again to give it that width. And then number 7 for some reason, which I've long since lost. And what I've done there is just bringing it down to nothing. Just so, yeah, it's in mono again. So that's our little break with this. And the same thing, the bass just repeats throughout this next section. And then there's one last sort of small variation on this last sort of rollout 16, which is this. So all that is really just I've messed around with the MIDI on this. So the riff almost sort of becomes half. So rather than the call and response, we've now almost got a sort of a feeling of that riff, but not so much, because we've got so much energy going on in the shuffles and everything else as well. And there's one little extra bass thing here, which if we take off the processing will probably be just an 808 with Logic's built-in distortion, distorting the hell out of it. And again, talking about these honky frequencies, you know, it just sounds bad. So the less of them you've got and the more scooped it sounds in this context, the better. And we've got a little bit of that pedal board as well for that extra sort of ampy feel. So really that's all the bass for this tune. You know, super simple, and really just something to sort of interplay off the rhythm. So from there, we'll look at the drums. Now the drums for this are quite organic and breaksy. you know, there's really sort of, I think this is the main kick. Very live sounding, very heavy in the mids as well. Again with these kicks, I think this might have been a techno kick to begin with. If I just, yeah, it's sort of got that real sort of low thump to it. So I've just taken out some of that knock, but I wanted a lot of that knock in there because we don't have a lot of instruments with their frequency range in that sort of 500 to 700 range. You can get away with having, you know, a lot more of that there. Again, 200, that's very boomy. So we're taking that out. And then with that, I've just got a live kick, which is sitting on top of it, which I've just taken all the lows out and just augmented the highs a bit, just to give it an extra bit of click. These are all run through a drum bus, which we'll come on to in a minute. We've got a couple of snares going on here. So we've got one, which is super punchy. Now that would have been something that, you know, just an old snare that I would have had just, you know, that's been processed and in my library. I mean, I think this is before I started really going into synthesizing snares. So that's just got a super nice peak there. And I've just brought it down just with obviously this resonance. There was a resonance here. Nasty resonance there, so we got rid of that. And then I've used the SPL Transient Shaper, which is really, really good. The Plugin Alliance Everything bundle is fantastic. So what I've done there is just whack up the attack a little bit. And I think with this tune as well, it's very important to make sure that that snare was in tune with everything else and sort of making sure that that was hitting on the G sharp. Otherwise it would have just sounded a bit odd to have, you know, a snare that's, if you got a tune where there isn't much tonality within the bass like this, you want something to really hammer home, and having that constant note is a really useful way of doing that. So on top of that, we've then got some hats. We've got some live hats and we've got some tappy hats. Nothing too sort of over the top here. I mean, I seem to have sample delay everything, which is something I don't do too much anymore. But this is a good way of getting width because, you know, rather than having, you know, sort of trying to force sort of width through wideness and things like that, this is a good way of just having that delayed signal. And because it's such high frequency, it doesn't really affect sort of phase and monocompatibility and that sort of thing. So that's just a really simple groove that's going through there. Then a classic break. And that's giving the drums a lot of that sort of organic rhythm and that feeling rather than anything sort of too, you know, rather than anything too sort of dry and static. This sort of fills out that airiness, and I've just rolled off the bottoms and just a little bit of a bump in the mid where it was a bit resonant. We've also got a couple of other breaks down here. So we've got another couple of classic breaks. And we've got a break which it's like the foundation for one of my tunes, Give 'Em Hell. And what I've done on here is just cut out some nasty resonances. I think with breaks, you know, it's good to leave them as raw as possible. But a lot of low cutting and sort of these areas around here, sort of 3000, tend to be quite brittle because of the way they've been pitched up over time. So it's important to sort of ensure that those aren't too sort of awry. With that other one, again, there was a nasty resonance here, so I've just cut that and brought a low cut up. And then I've overdriven them. And that's a really sort of heavy clipping. That's just to get rid of a lot of the transients, because I've already got such a snappy snare and a snappy kick. I don't want all that, and clipping is a nice way of doing that rather than messing up with the actual transients of the sound. It's just cutting them rather than doing a fade or anything sort of too destructive. I've used chroma verb just to give a slight bit of room, and then high cut and low that just as a small bit of ambience, but it's really not doing a huge amount. And then we've got an extra kick for some reason, which I think is just there to give another little extra boost to that sort of area around here. I turn the analyzer. Yeah, and that's just giving more of a pop to the sub bass that hits on that first note. You know, it's sort of a bit more upper mids, or sorry, lower mids. And then we've also got some more. We've got these hats here, which again, which I've sampled delayed, just get some nice, really nice width in them. And that's just simply from, you know, a drum kit within Logic, just open and close, to giving it a lot of, you know, real forward momentum. And I think within the, I mean, I'll play that without the breaks. I think it's, it just really loses all sort of personality within that. So having those breaks sort of, you know, really hitting up the sort of the main backbone and the meat of the drums, gives it a lot more vibe. And there's also a lot of sort of nice noise and atmos going on in there as well. So I've also put in my tops layer, which I've used on every tune since Iodine. And it's just, I know it works. It's a really nice way of just hammering this into a tune. I think it's something, when it comes to something as tops, that is just, it's there as a reinforcement rather than a standout thing. Having just a layer that you always go to is really useful and can save an awful lot of time, unless you're going for something really like, okay, I need these specific sound of rides. Just to fill out that fizz, I'm always whacking this in regardless of the style of tune. Then on the drum bus, I've just taken out a couple of little peaks here, but nothing too much. Then I've got a Saturn doing tape, and that just really livens it up, and I've just added a bit of presence on the top band. Then I've got another Saturn, which is then just doing the same sort of thing, just on the warm tape setting. And without those, you know, it starts to feel quite dull. So tape's a really nice way, and tape emulation is a really nice way of getting lots of nice top end sizzle and snap. And then I've done quite a severe low cut, just on the single band EQ, just to make sure that there's lots of room for the sub, really to sort of to come through and to cut through, basically. So really, I mean, that's the drum bus. You know, it's sort of just a nice combination of hits and breaks, and yeah, I'm not over EQing stuff. Sort of just trying to keep as much rawness and feel in there. And then there's sort of these nice little break sections here where we've got a little sort of mix up. So got a nice little. It's a classic break. We all know it. So I've just overdriven that again, sort of just to give a bit more of a clipped sort of sound there. And I've used a stereo spread, which is an interesting plugin which can be really useful in situations like this, where it creates, you know, sort of there's very much these bells and these curves on opposite ends of the frequency spectrum. And if you use it on lots of stuff, it sounds quite odd, but on standout bits that you really want to just pop out the speakers, it's a very useful little plugin. Then I've got a little splash here. Splash cymbals are really cool because they're not crashes. So it's a good way of bringing in like an 8-bar thing rather than a 16-bar, because it's just a bit, you know, thinking how drum would work. It was just a little cymbal to before you're going into a huge section. So that's a cool little high-pitched cymbal. And we've got another break here. Again, we all know it. Just with some more tape on it. I mean, this default sort of tape setting on Saturn is pretty good. Then we've got some more rides that come in. One from a break, which again I've used the spread on, but making sure it's only concentrating on the top end frequencies. And one more sort of organic, natural ride. You know, just a straight up sample from a drum kit. And that's just really sort of reinforcing that rhythm. And because this is such like a steppy tune, you know, it's nice to have something just going along like that. Same breaks coming in again. And then on to the last 16 of this section, where we've just got a very simple classic shaker from a break, just widened out, and a cowbell, just on the 3. And all that's added on there is that aim there. And all I've done there is cut up the first snare and fade it in just by repeating them, just so you get that cool jungle effect. Again with the spread, just to keep these things sort of wide and just sort of out in the ears, sort of in sort of an interesting location. And then bringing in those rides again for that last 8. So it's all really about arrangement with this and sort of, you know, how you can make the most from a simple sort of a couple of ideas, and a lot of that comes in bringing stuff in, taking stuff out, just to keep the ear interested. So if we look back a bit now at the intro, because we've got that vibe now, and sort of I wanted to, okay, so we've got this sort of club idea, and I suppose the initial thing, like sort of remembering the process of making this tune, was sending it off when it didn't really have this sort of clubby vibe to it. And then sort of thinking, okay, well, this could be better rather than just being a roller. So, you know, very much sort of wanted to set the situation, like I said, with having this vocal.
See, I know that some of y'all out here tonight.
And this sort of club beat, and I think then it just went into a straight beat. So I was thinking, okay, how can I build on this? So I think sort of a lot of this came from these sort of layers, which I think down the effects. Came from this, which, you know, as a sample from, you know, just like just YouTube videos of like old raves or something. You can hear the air horns, and then as soon as I put sort of that in, I thought, okay, now we've got sort of a vibe of what can continue throughout the track and sort of really bring this all together into a tune. So we put some vinyl on, a bit more of that old school vibe to it. And then when I bring that in with this sort of clubby beat, you get that sort of idea, like you can hear it coming from a tent. And that's the vibe I was going for with this. Got the open and close hat. There's a couple of other hats as well. You know, just sort of go full force energy. And then what I've done is this sort of very simple, idea of bringing down the bass. Now, this also actually brings me on to one of your next questions, which is, how do I know when to use sampling or synthesis? Pretty much, I'll use synthesis as a basis to continue with sampling. Like I've showed in the earlier thing with the bass on FMA. If I've just got a raw sound, then I like to have that raw sound and then manipulate that within audio and stretch it and reverse it and do all kinds of things to it. Because I think it's a lot more sort of fun and creative rather than, I'm just not someone that enjoys sitting tweaking synths. I much rather prefer to have sort of happy accidents, happy accidents going through sort of manipulating audio. yeah, I mean, that's just my style. Obviously, there's different things for different people. So if we go onto this. So that is the same bass again, which is just a bounce of the entire bass line. And then I've put this distortion pedal on it, an EQ, and all those EQ things acting as a filter. And just got rid of some of these mids. And the rest of it's very simple, and all that's doing is just creating a distorted, filtered sound of that original break, of that original bass line. So then I think also this brings us on to what is probably the sort of linchpin of the tune, which is what turned out to be the new vocal. Because obviously we couldn't use a Loletta Holloway vocal. So I had to find something else, and by doing a lot of trawling and just sort of searching throughout, I found this, which was the replacement vocal. And what's good about this vocal, which again adds to this sort of vibe, is this has got so much sort of crowd noise and noise in it that it becomes part of the track. And it's actually pretty boring without that. Really drags a lot away. So having that sort of noise is really useful. So don't be afraid of sort of not having noise and stuff. So I think it'd be good to bring on to one of your next questions here, which is, how do you keep this interesting? And I think having these little sort of switch ups and things like that on a simple bass line, and little things like the sort of reverse vocals and just little things like that. Sorry, I'll just... Little delays, little reverse vocals. Things like that are still keeping it interesting even with repetition. And as I was saying about arrangement when it came to rides and cowbells, just little things that bring in the sort of really interesting ear are always super useful. So yeah, as I said, this vocal was really just, it's got so much noise and everything in it that it sort of becomes part of this track and creates this sort of, party atmosphere going onto it. And then else from there, it's all very, very simple stuff of just, we've got some risers which are going on here. And also when it comes to, one of the questions here is how do you go about creating turnarounds? And risers and things like that are great at doing that because you're creating that tension and then you get that release. And these are all very simple, just saw waves, sine waves, or even just having the vocal pitched up, which I've done twice. Again, using as much of sort of what's already in the tune to, to really sort of make the most of it. And then we've got a couple of tones, which I think was sort of an air horn thing. Very simple. Which I've just pitched up and down, and a high string. So again, to answer another one of these questions, do I start tracks at the drop or the intro? Like this, it's totally could be anywhere, completely non-linear. There's no right or wrong way to do it. If you like making drums, make drums first. If you like making bass, make bass first. If you like finding samples like I do, find a sample. And you never really know sort of when it's gonna strike. I find using samples a good way of doing it because that's sort of already got an inspiration. I can build around there like that. That's already kicks off that vibe for me. So if we look now at what's going on in the master chain, which is actually pretty simple for this. So we'll just get on going. Got a very simple EQ, which is just dipping this frequency, bit resonant. That's it. Got a low cut of 32 hertz, which for this tune, because there's so much sort of distorted bass going on, I think that was needed. And then I've got a high cut at 16,000, which again, but that's a very gentle slope at 24 dB. So that was really just to sort of make sure nothing sort of too harsh was coming through on the tops, because it's quite a sort of raw tune. I don't want that super, super, super high end sparkle. And then within Ozone, bit of EQing just to bring out the pop and to keep some of this 2K under sort of, under wraps. There's a little bit of this excitement going on here. But very smooth, it's 100% wet mix, but it's just 2.4. I've got two limiters operating here. One which isn't actually doing an awful lot, but used to be a bit louder. And then just the standard Ozone on here. When it comes to sort of mastering this sort of track, if I'm doing a more musical one, I'll do probably a bit more in depth, but something sort of raw like this. Whack a limiter on, whack some clipping on. Yeah, it keeps that sort of vibe going. So when it comes down to, I think, splitting my creative, what's this question here? Do you separate your creative process into sessions? Not really. It's just sort of, again, non-linear sort of, I can, as I said, you might spend ages trawling for samples and nothing comes up, so you make a cool snare drum. So I personally don't do that. I try and keep it sort of loose as I possibly can, to sort of, keep everything rolling, really. So let's talk a bit more about these rises, because I know someone here has asked, approaching to making build-ups. And again, this sort of always comes down to using as much of the track that's already there. Kick rolls, snare rolls. I use a lot of kick rolls and things because my stuff's sort of fairly dance floor. I mean, even within my liquid stuff, I still use a lot of kick rolls. And yeah, I'm not sort of one. And the good thing, if you do want to have a transition without a huge build up, silence is always a good one. That's always good. Sort of more liquidy tracks, have a build up and then nothing, and then could be anything, then a drop. Just sort of trying to think of examples, but I can't now. But like a lot of more liquidy tunes will have that break, and then you don't have to have all that white noise and craziness really going on. Hi, this is Kove, and welcome to my production course for DNB Academy. Full breakdown of a whole track over the course of about 8 hours. Tips and tricks, synthesis, drum synthesis, bit of everything in there, and a real insight. Just a little bit more about these rises here. Again, this sort of comes into again using the most about what's in the session, and all that is just me clicking up 4, 5, 6 semitones, 7 semitones, all up here. And you still got that link in between both sides of the tune and everything that's going on there. So you don't have to have something as sort of cheesy as a sort of a super saw rising up or whatever. But it's still giving this urge of pushing on. I think this is a good tune to talk about when it comes down to the mix. Because this is the question here: what's the most important advice important advice producers should hear about mixing? Don't overcomplicate it. If you've got good processed sounds, and you can get way too caught up in the sonics and frequencies of certain elements and everything, but then you're really at risk of losing the whole vibe of the tune. Which is why I like tunes like this. Had I spent longer on it, I might have cut away loads of the breaks and lost a lot of the vibe that sort of makes a tune. I probably would have cleaned up this vocal and left out all this sort of stuff, and it would have lost the vibe. I think just be sort of use metering. Metering is very important. Just be aware of sort of rogue frequencies and things like that. But you've got to have your own sound, and you don't want everything to be sort of super polished unless you're going for that super sound. Just don't get too caught up in losing what the vibe and the initial spark of inspiration was. There's so much reference made towards sort of the 90s now and the 90s style, and half of that stuff is EQ'd bizarrely and weird stereo stuff. So, but the vibe of that is still there, and that's what made those tunes so important. So don't get too caught up in that. What's my best advice for a beginner producer? If I was to talk about advice for a beginner producer, listen to other stuff, but don't get too caught up in trying to copy. Listen to how things are working, how things are structured. But I think my biggest advice is keep stuff simple. It's very much a thing that I think all producers do when they start out, is they throw so much at music thinking more is better, and that's not the case. The simple tunes are always the ones that sort of seem to stick around and have good longevity, and it's not a situation to show off what you can do. You don't need to do that. Keep things simple ideas, great riffs. If you've got a great riff, stick with that great riff. Don't throw in 100 turnarounds and crazy noises. Having 150 tracks in a project, all doing different things without any sort of link is that's just an engineering exercise at the end of the day, rather than writing an actual piece of music. So I think that's the most important thing. Which also brings me on to a good one, which is what's your best advice for writer's block? Which has been, I think, something ever present throughout lockdown and the situation we've all been in. I've had terrible writer's block. I haven't written anything for ages. And I just couldn't get an idea going. And it's very bizarre, but I think the important thing to do is take some time away from sitting at your desk hammering. Get out of the studio, go and do something else. And don't feel guilty that you're doing something else. And something will come right at a different tempo. Try something completely different. I found it I just couldn't write anything, because I suppose if there's nowhere to play your music like there was for the last 18 months, then it's very hard to get inspiration for that. But luckily things are changing a bit now. So yeah, got some more music coming out, finally. If I had to pick 5 plugins, what would they be? I would probably say... It's a tough one. Probably Pro Q3, just because it's very utilitarian and super useful. Channel EQs and Logic's great, but I find for dynamic EQs, Pro Q3 is great. Gullfloss is sort of my go-to, which they've now updated to the Master Edition. I haven't used it on this track because this wasn't out then, but super useful tool for balancing your mix and getting rid of any masking. Super useful. 3, probably Serum, because you can make anything in it, and yeah, it's really useful. 4 would probably be a Valhalla verb or the Arturia reverb, this plate reverb. I use this a lot in the course. This is one of my favorite plugins. It's just fantastic, and you can get so many sounds out of it. It sounds really warm and analog. Aside from that, potentially the room, that's really useful for creating a lot of ambience. You know, I use that a lot for very sort of short delays. Yeah, which is super useful. And 5 would probably be Ozone, or just a really good limiter. Newfangled Elevate I use a lot. Ozone's good. Yeah, just anything to get yourself sort of pumping, really. But you know, any tool can be used to in a super creative way. So let's just have a look at the second breakdown, because this is a good way to approach sort of this sort of idea of we've referred back to the first drop here. It's pretty much a straight up copy, but with these sort of tunes you can get away with that because it's a dance floor tune. Same thing with the bass, couple of crashes, bit of noise. You know, these aren't groundbreaking things. And the same with the build up of the synths. Just slowly coming up and coming up. And that's still a sub synth there, which is in the build up, but I've just taken the sub out. So you really just didn't get that low mid. Again, giving that idea of what I was talking about in terms of simple tunes and using an idea as much as you can. It's still the same thing, but there's no sub in it. So once you get the idea of that in your ear, then you know, something else will. Once the main drop comes in, you're going, oh, okay, that's the same idea, but it's way more powerful. To answer one of the last questions on here, because I think, yeah, but you know, a lot of these questions sort of, you know, how do I come up with an idea before I go in the studio? Sometimes I will have an idea. Sometimes you'll hear something on the telly, you'll listen to a podcast or something, you hear a quote or whatever. But I'm not really someone who goes and sits down and goes, right, I'm going to work. You know, luckily I've become, since sort of computers have become way more powerful and everything, I'm a lot more mobile now with my production, and I don't just have to be sat in the studio, you know, which is really good, because you can be working on the move, or you can be working on a train, or your garden, wherever. Yeah, and there was within this tune, there's a slight switch up on this second, which again, it's just the riff changing ever so slightly. Again, just messing with the MIDI. That's it. And just as a little idea. So something very simple, but for a tune this simple, very, very minor tweaks can do an awful lot to create interest, really, you know. And that's all you need. You don't need to overdo it. Just keep it simple. To answer the last question that I've been sent, what is the game-changing moment that changed everything in your productions? That's a good question. And sort of it's very hard to pin down. But I think when I had my first piece of music signed, which was to Viper, which was Stellar, and Breach, which was in 2011 or 12, which I'd worked on for ages, but they were still, you know, pretty sort of rough around the edges. Brendan Futurebound sort of went through a lot of the mixdowns and everything with me, and sort of having those insights. And, you know, these sort of things like courses and everything weren't available then. So to have someone do that for you was huge. And that's sort of when I started to twig like this idea of less is more. And you don't have to throw everything at the wall, and you just need elements that stick out and really sort of take the attention, and then everything builds around that. You know, rather than I think what I was doing at the time, which is making everything loud and trying to make everything the front. You know, huge risers, huge white noise. Yeah. So that sort of idea of keeping the sort of depth idea of having things at the front and then sort of everything building around that, and simple ideas backed up by other stuff. That was the game-changing moment, really. How long have I been producing, and how have you managed to keep yourself motivated? Probably, I've been producing since 2007, I think. And yeah, I suppose it's just always been what I've always done. So I've never really sort of had to sort of thought about that, to be honest. So yeah, I've never really thought about it. How do I keep myself motivated? Yeah, I mean, I love making music. It's sort of been my passion for a long time, and my job for the last sort of 10 odd years now. So it's a good motivator to be able to do what you love. And that's important in life. So I really hope you've enjoyed this breakdown and answering some questions, and yeah, a little insight into how I made tonight. And I'll be going over a lot more of these ideas and everything in my full course again for DNB Academy, where we'll be building a tune from scratch. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you enjoy the course. Cheers. Hi, this is Kove, and welcome to my production course for DNB Academy. Full breakdown of the whole track over the course of about 8 hours. Tips and tricks, synthesis, drum synthesis, a bit of everything in there, and a real insight.